Is Roger Weatherall. I'm the U.S. coordinator for the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, one of the core associations of the Universal Peace Federation. And our mission is to attract and develop innovative business and government leaders, and to develop principles to empower these leaders to collectively impact society through collaboration, education, personal development, and deepened relationships that will create an environment that's conducive to mutual prosperity between nations and between individuals. I want to introduce our topic for today. I think everyone listening to the webinar is familiar with the recent state visits by President Yoon of the Republic of Korea to the US, and then by the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida to Korea. And this has changed the diplomatic climate in this part of the world. And today we're going to look at how these exchanges have really affected this diplomatic environment in Northeast Asia, and what are the possibilities for perhaps increased dialogue with North Korea at this time. So with this visit of the top leaders of Japan and Korea, then clearly the Korea and the US are aligning on their policy with this Washington Declaration, and many experts are debating whether we're entering a new Cold War in this part of the world, with, of course, China being one of the main protagonists that we are dealing with. So we're going to have an interesting discussion today between two of the foremost experts in this field, who are long-standing observers of Asia on the prospects for denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. And we'll be hearing first from Professor Andrei Lankov, who will present on this topic, and then Ambassador Joseph DeTrani will be presenting. This is a pre-recorded webinar, so I'm going to be playing back the video, and then at the end, we may have some time for additional discussion amongst the audience. So now I'm just going to share the video screen, and then Alan Jessen, the North American coordinator for IAED, is moderating this webinar today, and so he will introduce our speakers.
Professor Lankov was born in Leningrad, now Petersburg. He completed his undergraduate and graduate studies at Leningrad State University. In 1966 to 2004, he taught Korean history at the Australian National University. And since 2004, he has been teaching at Kookmin University, or College of Social Studies, and also serves as the director of the KoreaRiskGroup.com. His major research interest is North Korean history and society. He's published numerous books on Korea, and we will put a link in the Amazon page chat for anyone who'd like to purchase some of his books. He's contributed to Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, Newsweek, published a number of academic articles, including articles in foreign affairs and global policy. And in 2017, Dr. Lankov was recognized as by the Foreign Policy magazine as put him on the list of the global thinkers. So we're really privileged, sir, and if you want to share your comments on the Korean Peninsula as you see things. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not going to be optimistic. Personally, I have always been very skeptical about idea of denuclearization. Most likely chances of North Korea's denuclearization were lost around 2002. But maybe a bit earlier, maybe never existed. But what is quite clear right now, that these chances, always very low, almost non-existent, have never been as low as now. Why? I would describe the current situation as, it's a train following some track, rails. You can go faster, you can go slower, you can stop maybe if you are lucky, but you cannot really change your trajectory. What's happened over the last few years? Attempts to negotiate something, to reach some agreement with North Korea by President Trump ended in failure. It's a big question whether it was achievable, because obviously President Trump sincerely hoped to get a denuclearization deal. North Koreans were not going to go to surrender their nuclear weapons, but they were probably going to make some concessions, but it's ancient history now. Right now, the situation in East Asia is determined by the competition between the United States and China, rivalry, conflict, if you like, the Second Cold War. And it's a good news for North Korea, because in past, North Korean diplomacy was working very hard to play great powers against one another, to maneuver between them, securing economic assistance, securing all kind of financial benefits, and giving very little in return. Now they don't need to do it because China badly needs North Korea as a buffer zone. They need a stable and divided Korean peninsula. It's not very new. China has always wanted a stable and divided Korean peninsula. But right now, it's an overwhelming concern. China is willing to tolerate North Korean nuclear development because they don't want to deal with instability in a country nearby, and they don't want to deal with a unified Korea, which will be democratic, nationalistic, and pro-American. Not certainly, but almost certainly. So they want to keep South Korea afloat. They are sending fuel. They are sending food and fertilizer, not much, just enough to make sure that nothing seriously bad is going to happen in North Korea. And it's not a big cost to China for the Chinese budget. It's a small change, and they can easily do it for decades. North Koreans are also happy. They don't want to be dependent on China, but seemingly China does not put many demands. China does not require concessions from North Korea because they just want North Korea to stay alive. And you know, North Korean leaders don't mind. They have the same idea. They try to control Chinese penetration, so we should not see North Korea as a Chinese puppet. No way. They try to remain as independent from China as possible, but they are happy to get Chinese money. And it means that they are not in need of, they don't see why they should make concessions. Because they are getting from China what they need, and they are not interested in talking with other powers. They get basic minimum from China. Talking about their nuclear program, it was initially started as security kind of deterrence. It was initially largely defensive because they saw what happened to Libya. Libyan dictator agreed to surrender nuclear weapons in exchange for economic benefits. Then revolution began. Countries of NATO intervened, prevented him from carpet bombing rebellious cities, preventing him from mass murder of opposition supporters, and as a result, he was killed. Had Libya kept nuclear weapons, it would not happen. And maybe Gaddafi or his son would be in charge even now. North Koreans saw it and they learned the lesson. They saw Ukraine. Ukraine believed promises of the United States, UK, and Russia, who guaranteed their territorial integrity in exchange for surrender of the nuclear weapons Ukraine got after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It shipped nuclear weapons to Russia. It lost Crimea, and it's now under a massive, large-scale attack on scale the world has not seen for decades. What is the lesson for North Koreans? Of course, keep nukes. And they see how careful the United States, how restricted it is, self-restricted, in assisting Ukraine, most likely because United States does not want escalation in relations with the nuclear Russia. What is the lesson for North Korea? Keep nukes. So initially it was defensive, but right now there are some bad developments. That is, it's gradually developing to something more aggressive. First of all, North Koreans are working to develop ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of hitting the continental United States. They first tested such missiles in 2017, and recently they tested yet another ICBM, which is a solid fuel ICBM, for launch in minutes, and it's far more difficult to be destroyed before it's launched. And their task is to have sufficient number of ICBMs capable of penetrating the American anti-missile defenses. At the same time, they are working on the tactical nukes. And their game plan is quite clear. They need ICBMs to blackmail Americans into keeping away from a possible confrontation in Korea. And they need tactical nukes to neutralize significant superiority of South Korea in conventional weapons. Once they do it, they can start dreaming about conquest of the South, or at least a military defeat of the South, so they will impose some kind of unequal confederation, unequal treaty. They make South Korea, well, if you like, into something like very big Hong Kong. Well, so it's quite dangerous. And ideally, what can be done about it? I would say that the only solution, realistic solution, is to do something like Hanoi deal, because it was something North Koreans suggested back in during the last meeting in 2019 in February in Hanoi. The idea was that North Koreans would agree to physically destroy significant part of their nuclear facilities, sanctions would be lifted, and it would mean sort of freeze of North Korea nuclear program. I'm not saying that conditions in Hanoi were acceptable. They were not. The idea was acceptable. North Koreans were going to surrender only a fraction of their nuclear facilities, and they wanted to have all sanctions lifted. It was not realistic, but it's a kind of a general line. However, I'm skeptical, because such a degree would imply that the United States would implicitly or even explicitly accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear state. And this is not that any American administration which will make such a deal will find itself under attack of media, Congress, and everybody will accuse such a president in being gutless, spineless, weak, and so on. Because common public in the United States does not realize that North Korea's nuclear program is irreversible. North Korea is a nuclear state, period. Whether it's recognized as such or not, it's irrelevant. US Congress cannot change your laws of the nuclear physics. At any rate, any American administration which will try to implement such a deal will suffer serious domestic political losses, so they probably will not do it. And North Koreans will keep working to make or to develop, to perfect their ICBMs, becoming more and more dangerous. So basically, it's how I see the prospects for the next decade or maybe more. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Lankov. As you mentioned, it's kind of a pessimistic view, but it's a realistic one from many points of view. So thank you for that. I'm anxious to hear from our next speaker. Then we'll have some discussion. Our next speaker is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. He is a former special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea, and he told us he just wants a short introduction. We could give him a much longer introduction, but here is the short version. Ambassador Joseph DeTrani is a commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was a special envoy for negotiations with North Korea, the director of the National Counter-Proliferation Center, and associate director of national intelligence. So thank you, Ambassador. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and it's an honor being here, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Dr. Lankov, for a very excellent presentation. Much of what you said I agree with. I think the situation is dire right now. North Korea, as you correctly stated, just launched in April an intercontinental ballistic missile, solid fuel, that could, projection-wise, reach the whole of the United States. What a statement that is. And what they're doing with their strategic forces and what they're doing with tactical nuclear, what they're doing with other short-range, medium-range ballistic missiles, whether it's cruise missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And indeed, North Korea, as announced by Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim Jong-un, announced a preemptive policy, a first-use policy, where if there's an imminent threat to the security of the leadership, command and control in North Korea, or a perceived imminent threat to the security of the leadership, they could and they would use, on a first-use basis, nuclear weapons. This is very dire. And I think the trajectory is even more dire than what we're seeing today. Concern has to be, and I think rightfully so it is, accidental conflict, miscalculation, miscommunication, misunderstanding. You know, when you think of preemptive use of nuclear weapons, one would have to say, my goodness, one must be very sure of an imminent threat or perceived imminent threat to have the security, to have the intelligence, to have the information necessary. And we're hearing now North Korea is talking about putting a satellite, reconnaissance satellite in orbit. Well, what does that tell you? Their structure, their infrastructure to determine what is imminent is also questionable. So yes, the situation is dire and it's getting worse. And we're not talking to North Korea. And as Professor Lankov indicated, China, or alluded to, China is not facilitating communications with North Korea. They're not encouraging North Korea to come back to negotiations. But let me submit this. For many years, and in many discussions with North Koreans, myself and many others, it's been made very clear to the United States, but also to China and to Russia, to Japan, to South Korea, that Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un, what they want is a normal relationship with the United States, but they want that normal relationship with the United States on their own terms as a nuclear weapons state. And as was mentioned to me many times, indeed in my first meeting in 2003 in the six-party talks with my counterpart, I was told very clearly, treat us the way you treat Pakistan, and we could be good friends of the United States. And as he was told then, as we continue to tell, for the reasons that Dr. Lankov indicated, we will never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. The element of proliferation in the region would be great. Others, whether it be South Korea, Japan, others would seek nuclear weapons, but also selling or providing in some form fissile material for a dirty bomb or a nuclear weapon to a terrorist organization. That's something we have to consider. So I think correctly so, the United States position has been and continues to be, we will never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. The fact is they do have nuclear weapons, yes. I totally agree with Dr. Lankov. It's de facto record, they do. But de jure, we will never accept that. And what we are pursuing, and we will continue to pursue, although the likelihood is nil. At this time, it's literally nil. But that doesn't mean things can't change in the future. We looked at the agreed framework in 1994. That was Kim Il-sung. And then in 2003 to 2005, we had a joint statement in September 19, 2005, where North Korea committed to complete verifiable dismantlement of all their nuclear weapons and facilities in return for a path to normal relations, the discussion of the provision of light water reactors for civilian nuclear energy purposes, economic development assistance, and the lifting of all any sanctions. That was a very positive joint statement. And this was the six parties. This was China hosting six parties with South Korea and Japan, but certainly with Russia and the United States. A very significant, and unfortunately in 2009 that fell apart because North Korea was concerned with monitors leaving the Yongbyon facility and maybe discovering what we had said were suspicious, non-declared nuclear sites. And that was the end of the agreed framework in 2002 because of the same issue, highly enriched uranium. In 2009, it fell apart again for concern that the United States and others, these monitors, would discover other facilities, again, highly enriched uranium. And we saw this in 2018 and 2019. In 2018, we saw a Singapore agreement, a statement, a very short statement, but I think a very positive statement. It said North Korea was prepared to complete, or I should say the Korean Peninsula, complete verifiable denuclearization in return for a transformation of a relationship with the United States, etc. And as Dr. Lankov indicated so correctly, it fell apart in Hanoi in 2019, where North Korea said, lift all sanctions. I might add, all sanctions that were imposed subsequent to 2016. 2016, not before 2016. I think former Foreign Minister Lee Yoon-ho made it very clear in a press statement at that time. They weren't talking about all sanctions. They were talking about sanctions imposed subsequent to 2016. They wanted those lifted in return for, if you will, the dismantlement of the Yongbyon plutonium facility. And I might add, the Yongbyon plutonium facility, it has a uranium enrichment facility there. They're building a light water reactor facility there. There are a number of components to the Yongbyon facility. It wasn't a bad offer, a going in offer. I think in retrospect, I think many people were saying, you know, should we have just walked away from it? Should that have been the basis for continued negotiations at a lower level, not a presidential level? I think some people would say, what happened? Because subsequent to Hanoi, everything stopped. Everything stopped. And now the United States and the People's Republic of China, China's not facilitating in this regard. Facilitating maybe is not the right word, but encouraging North Korea to come back to negotiations. As we have indicated, it's a willingness to come back to negotiations, to talk about a path. Now, the likelihood of North Korea completely verifiably dismantling all nuclear weapons, that's very unrealistic at this moment. Totally agree. You look at Libya. We're telling them, look at Libya. Well, look at Libya. As Dr. Lankov indicated, that's not the lesson we want. The lesson here is move towards denuclearization, move towards normalization of relations, maybe have liaison offices, intersections in the respective capitals. Work on the, if you will, you did use the word confederation, maybe coming together between the North and South, bringing the separated families together, the road line, bringing those connections, economic connections between the North and the South, opening Mount Kumgang, the Kaesung Industrial Complex, movement towards, whether it's a confederation or what have you, but a more normal, with less enmity, less confrontation. So the likelihood of accidental conflict is not there. And that's what negotiations would do. That's what, not even negotiations, that's what meetings would do, discussions would do. They don't have to be at a presidential level. We can go back to negotiations and talk about, especially now when we're talking about the use of a preemptive, first use of nuclear weapons. I mean, is this where we want to be? And now and I think correctly so, we had a very successful visit of President Yoon Suk-yeol to the United States. That state visit was extremely positive. And the Washington Declaration, I think, was very positive. It made it very clear. It made it very clear that we are enhancing deterrence, nuclear deterrence, extended nuclear deterrence. And that's a reality, because what we're seeing in North Korea, But you see where this is going. Where we're going, we're talking about enhancing correctly so deterrence with the Washington Declaration, with the visit of nuclear-armed submarines to ports in South Korea, a nuclear consultative group. This is all movement in that direction. The introduction of strategic assets in joint military exercises. And North Korea on their side continues to ratchet things up with nuclear missile developments. And indeed, they continue to build more nuclear weapons that could be mated to these ballistic missile delivery systems, to include hypersonic missiles that theoretically could defeat missile defense systems. So this is a very dire, correctly so, and I agree totally with Professor Lankov. This is a very dire situation. And what we have to do is we have to de-escalate. We have to come back to negotiations. And hopefully China, because China has a lot of leverage with North Korea. And I heard what Professor Lankov said about, well, China wants to see a divided Korean peninsula. They see North Korea, I don't disagree with that, as a buffer state. And but yes, but a normal relationship with the United States and a dialogue with the People's Republic of China, as the two Koreas sort of move together, whether it's looking at a reunification with the prospects of reunification for a federation or a confederation, where there'd be two separate entities but amicable, that could trade, that could interact, that could de-escalate, and that doesn't have to fear that there's going to be conflict, accidental conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and the likelihood of millions of people on both sides. And we saw what happened in the Korean War with conventional weapons for 3 years. The casualties were immense. Could you imagine what would happen now with the introduction of strategic capabilities, whether it be tactical nukes, even conventional, within a period of 1 day, 10 million people in Seoul alone? What are we talking about? So I think the premise I'm making, and I'll end on this note, is this. I don't think Kim Jong-un, like Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, Kim Jong-il, his father, who wanted a relationship with the United States and moved towards that, I don't think he wants to live as a pariah state, heavily sanctioned, tethered to China and the Russian Federation. I think he was looking for more than that. And I think we saw some of that in Hanoi, but indeed we saw a lot of that in Singapore, where he even had videos of himself in Singapore showing it to his own people in North Korea. First time that's ever happened. He's showing himself in Singapore, but also a very sophisticated, advanced, developed Singapore. And this is what President Donald Trump at the time said. This is where North Korea can be moving in that direction. So we're not putting complete verifiable denuclearization immediately on the table. You do that first, and then we'll move in that direction. This is going to take years, decades. But if the eventual goal could be not only de-escalation, but eventually we'll talk about denuclearization and so forth, because it also serves the purpose of not only that as a goal and de-escalation, de-emphasizing the tension that we have now, but also a message to South Korea, and we saw this with the Washington Declaration, that you don't need to build your own nuclear weapons. The United States is there for you with the nuclear umbrella. A message to Japan in the same way, because if North Korea continues and we just accept the de facto recognition that North Korea will continue and no emphasis, no effort to move towards a denuclearization, no matter how many years this will be, what does it say to a South Korea? What does it say to a Japan? What does it say to others? And this we're talking about nuclear proliferation in a significant way. So I'll end on this note. I think it's incumbent on all countries, but certainly the United States and the Republic of Korea, working with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, to sort of come back together to negotiations. And I think this is where China and Russia, I might add, can encourage North Korea to do that. And I don't think they should be concerned that the United States is going to be moving into, and there'll be reunification, moving up to the Yalu River, et cetera. This is 1950s mind thought. There's a lot of that we've progressed since 1950, hopefully, and I think we have, where we can come together and have agreements. And again, whether it's a confederation, whether it's reunification, and ideally it would be reunification, but indeed to de-escalate where we are now. And with the goal eventually, we could talk about denuclearization, but again, it could be years, decades, but let's start normalizing a relationship. Let's start coming together. Let's start de-escalating. And hopefully as China and the United States start looking at where they could, again, start to cooperate on whether it's pandemics, whether it's national security issues, whether it's non-proliferation issues, the tension there between China and the US hopefully will improve, will de-escalate. And relations will improve. And we can come back to maybe reconstituting the six-party talks. Maybe with China, as they're doing with Ukraine, talking about mediating and try to resolve the carnage that's going on with the war in Ukraine. Maybe, again, take the lead and host a reconstituted six-party talks. That would allay the concerns in North Korea, or that there's any attempt to take over to affect regime change. That's not the game. But we're talking about not only North Korea as an entity, but we're talking about 25 million people, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll end on this note. Over 40% of the population is malnourished. That's a UN and DPRK statistic that's out there. And we're looking at the possibility, like in the 90s, of food scarcity. And in the 90s, was over 1 million people die of starvation. And we're looking at that. That's not, I don't think, where Kim Jong-un wants North Korea to be and to go. And I don't think that will lend stability to the region. And that's where I think the People's Republic of China would agree that if we could de-escalate and we can come back, maybe reconstitute, if not reconstitute the six-party talks, bring the key players together and to sit down and talk about de-escalation. And with the prospects of lifting sanctions, easing sanctions, eventually lifting sanctions, but North Korea ceasing and desisting immediately. No more nuclear tests, no seventh nuclear test, no more ballistic missile launches. Cease and desist, a moratorium on that in return for something. There's so much we could be putting on the table. There's so much that lends itself to creativity. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit, we are not being very proactive. We're not being very creative. And I think that's a shame, because we're looking at the prospects of accidental conflict, and that would be on all of us, that we haven't worked harder. I'll end on that.
Well, very, very excellent. Thank you. I'm inspired, actually, just to think a little bit about your last point about the need for creativity and energy and hope. And let's move forward in a even if it's a slow, but let's move forward. I really take that serious lesson you mentioned, Ambassador, and that you think Kim is looking for more. He's not just satisfied. How could he possibly be satisfied with a situation with his country and the tensions and all? Did he indicate that he's looking for more? I think that's a very good question you brought up, and maybe we can work with that. So, to live together with some kind of amicable relationship. I have a few questions, but first I'd like to invite Professor Lankov to share any thoughts he has based on the ambassador's comments here. Thank you.
Well, I basically agree. There is one problem, however. North Koreans are absolutely determined not to even pretend they are talking about denuclearization. Because Ambassador said that it would be possible to start something now with the assumption that CVID is going to happen, but decades down the track. And I believe that A, CVID is not going to happen as long as the Kim family stays in charge. B, it would be a good idea to dishonestly claim that the final goal of talks is CVID. Why? Because it will allow to justify such talks, reducing the damage to the international non-proliferation regime and reducing the backlash from the American domestic hardliners. However, there is a bad news. Obviously, North Koreans are not going, they were going to pretend to play this dishonest game, to pretend that they were going to accept CVID eventually at some distant point of future, not anymore. Can we persuade North Koreans to do a bit of diplomatic dishonesty? I hope. I'm not sure. Because as Ambassador said correctly, they want better relations with the United States, but they want better relations as another nuclear power, period. And this is a problem. Can they pretend, after all, the United States, according to the letter of 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, like all other nuclear states, United States also promised that at some unspecified point in the distant future, the United States would also surrender its nuclear weapons. Of course, it's dishonesty. Of course, it's lie. Well, in the long run, probably it will happen after all. But it has nothing to do with NPT Treaty of 1968. However, if Americans are doing such dishonest statement, why not North Koreans? I don't know. North Koreans don't want, and it's one of the obstacles. And other obstacle is, of course, the domestic, as I have said, domestic environment, because an American administration who will do it, who will follow the strategy which was basically suggested by Ambassador, it will be very good. Such administration will do a great good to the US national interest and to the security of the world. Bad news is, significant part of the American society will not accept it. Bad news is that such administration is going to be criticized. So, in a democracy, for an American president to make such a deal with North Korea means a great deal of losses, reducing approval rating, reducing chances for himself or herself or his or her party to win the next elections, maybe not much or maybe a lot, reducing, and getting almost nothing in exchange. Is it possible? I don't know. I don't know. So I'm a bit skeptical, even though I basically completely agree with Ambassador DeTrani that it's the only way to go. I don't say anything else. I don't see any other way. But right now, North Koreans are not willing to play this game because they will never force themselves to say, to dishonestly say that they're going to talk about denuclearization. And Americans are also not very interested because administration will face massive domestic backlash. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask the question to both of you about specifically the Washington Declaration and the recent diplomacy too between Japan and Korea. Does that change any calculus or does it open up any opportunity for more dialogue? Does it put Korea in a better position to be a mediator in the region in some way? So are there some signs there that we can build from?
So if I could, Alan,
Yes.
let me take that. I'll take your question and then look to Dr. Lankov. But let me just respond very briefly to some excellent points that Dr. Lankov just made. Personally, I think, and we saw this with former President Donald Trump's meetings with Chairman Kim Jong-un in Singapore and then in Hanoi. I think the American public, I think if Donald Trump was successful in Hanoi and came back with something, and even in 2000 with President Bill Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, we were looking at intersections in our respective capitals. I think if Donald Trump in 2019 came back with something, I don't think there would be an outcry. I think the American people would say, okay, especially if this lends itself to a more peaceful environment on the Korean Peninsula where we could have the separated families coming together. and they could de-escalate that tension that's going on there, and maybe reconstitute the Kaesong industrial complex, where there's some prospects for meaningful dialogue between them. I don't think people would be opposed to that. I don't think people are so ideologically offensive, or Pyongyang is so ideologically offensive to the United States citizenry that people would say you can't deal with them. I think if they would see North Korea as becoming amenable to reestablishing a meaningful, less enmity between the North and South, I think people, even intersections, we were talking about that in 2000, and we were talking about, I think, even in 2017, 2019. I don't think people would be offended, but I don't think politically that would be a disaster. And on the question of being dishonest, I think when the U.S. signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was, and correctly so, Dr. Lankov indicated, a commitment on the nuclear weapon states to move towards dismantlement, to disarmament, and so forth. And I think what started a new start, both the Russian Federation and the United States have come down to 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons. I mean, we had arsenals that were in the tens of thousands, and now we're talking about 1,550 deployed. So yeah, we've come down. Will we ever? The trajectory is now going in the other direction, unfortunately. That's why we have to move in a different direction. We have to look towards coming together and talking about some sort of reconciliation on some of these critically important issues. On the question of the Washington Declaration, let me just say, I think what's so positive about the Washington Declaration, and indeed is what's even more positive, is what's happening between South Korea and Japan. Kishida's visit to the Republic of Korea over the weekend, and certainly President Yoon's visit to Tokyo, and now discussions about sharing reconnaissance information, so that there will be no misunderstanding about what North Korea is doing with their nuclear weapons and their ballistic missile launches. I think this is all very, very positive developments, and I think what the Washington Declaration did is allay the concerns in South Korea, and in Japan, I might add, about the need for South Korea to build their own nuclear weapons, that the United States is there for them.
All right, thank you. Anything to add, Professor Lankov, to that?
Yes, talking about two remarks. First of all, Japan, there is an improvement. There is one problem, however. Relations to Japan remains probably the last serious issue of Korea's foreign policy, which is subjected to the domestic political discussion. In the past, the South Korean left and right could not agree on many more issues of foreign policy, like the relations with the United States. Now, the left, which used to be sort of mildly anti-American, is very pro-American. Left is quite skeptical about China, but Japan is an issue. And what we have seen, the previous right-wing administration of Park Geun-hye negotiated a lot of agreements aimed at improving relations with Japan. A lot of issues were solved under Park Geun-hye by 2016. The next elections were won by the left, and they immediately walked away from all these agreements, unilaterally broke agreements and demanded renegotiations. Now we have right in power. They basically cancel the decision of the left, and they try to make better relations with Japan. Well, but let's not forget, they won the last elections with a narrow margin of 0.7%. Left will be in power. Maybe next elections, maybe elections after next. What will they do indeed with Japan? I don't know. And it's not a polite way to say that they will break all the agreement possible. Maybe not, because South Korea is changing, largely because there is a growing concern about rise of China. So it's increasingly China, not Japan, is seen as a kind of the dangerous place by the South Korean left. And for the North Korean left, sorry, for the South Korean right, it has been the opinion for decades. But still, I'm a bit skeptical, because we have seen all this, reconciliation with Japan reversed so many times. I'm a bit skeptical. And talking about Washington Declaration, Ambassador DeTrani mentioned a very important task, because there is something which is new. A growing interest about developing its own nuclear weapons inside South Korea. Well, South Korean public, as opinion polls indicate, South Korean public has always been in favor of going nuclear. But the South Korean elite has never taken such talk seriously, and it changed almost overnight. There is a serious discussion inside South Korean political class about developing its own nuclear weapons. And Washington Declaration, well, it's complicated issue whether it will stop it, but at least it's an argument against going nuclear, and it's probably the most important part of the declaration. Not widely understood, because you basically have to be inside South Korea, you have to read Korean to see how fast support for South Korean nuclear weapons is growing. Yeah.
Ambassador, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree with Professor Lankov. I think there is I think there was some recent polls, over 70% of the population in South Korea were interested in acquiring their own nuclear weapons capability. So yes, I agree, there is that. But I do think the Washington Declaration, if you will, the U.S. Nuclear umbrella commitments to the Republic of Korea, with that declaration and the visits of, again, a nuclear armed submarine supports and nuclear consultative group. I think this is allayed that concern right now, but I think it will reappear. A lot will depend on North Korea. A lot will depend on what's happening in the North, and where North Korea is going with more nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and some very heated rhetoric, as we saw over the last few months when they were talking about South Korea as being an enemy state. So yeah, I think it's a late concern at this moment, but it's something that we have to watch. I think it would be a terrible mistake if South Korea, as they did in the 1970s, pursued their own nuclear weapons capability, and Japan instead, for reasons I cited before. The nuclear arms race in the region is not in anyone's interest, and certainly the possibility of a terrorist organization getting hands on fissile material, a nuclear weapon, is always going to be there. And I think we saw a little of this in Syria, in Syria, when the Israelis took out the Syrian nuclear complex in Al-Kabar in September 2007. I think the possibility of not only having North Korea having the nuclear weapons, but also providing it to other states, and this is what I think we would see if other states were moving in that direction. Not only not legitimately, not diplomatically doing this, but with rogue elements, with criminal elements, with the possibility of fissile material getting into the hands of terrorists and bad actors for a dirty bomb. It's always going to be there. This is not the environment we want to be in. There's so much we can do to change this trajectory. So much that we have to do to change this trajectory. And I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing any of that. And I think that's a shame, because I think the prospects of accidentally coming into conflict becomes that much greater.
On that note, I read a little bit in the Asian Times. They were talking about in response to all this activity between the countries, and they specifically mentioned that they were calling for a renewing of the existing international institutions that would strengthen dialogue and they specifically mentioned the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat between South Korea, Japan, and China. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on that? Did I get that correct from some of their encouragement that this might open up some of those structures?
Yes, and you mentioned China as one of the countries there. I mean, so much depends on China's willingness to engender, to foster this movement in that direction. And unfortunately, and a lot of it, given the tension between the United States and the People's Republic of China, we're just not seeing that impetus coming out of Beijing, and that so much is. So we rely so heavily on China as we did in the six-party talks, and they were success. They in that limited context where the talks were successful, and China, as the host, was able to bring the North Koreans to the table with the United States and Russia and Japan and South Korea. So yes, but only if China is an active player.
Okay, and let's bring in some economics into this security discussion as well. These are tremendous trading partners. All the countries here, China is a large trading partner. Does this change that? We've heard a little retaliation talk or threats from China because of the Washington declaration. Is that likely to impinge on an economic trade? Or can trade be used, Professor Lankov, in some way to maintain a positive forward motion?
Yeah, I think that basically now there is this idea about excluding China from the supply chains, vital supply chains, and it's a development which is probably objectively lead to certain reduction of trade between China and South Korea. Talking about the Chinese sanctions, so to say, as a reaction to the Washington declarations, they are not happy about it, and they also understand that now South Korea is under great pressure to disengage China, pressure from Washington. At least exclude China from all the supply chain related to semiconductors, batteries, and the like. And they are basically following this pressure, partially because relations with United States are so much more important for the South than relations with China, partially because of really suspicious attitude to China. So talking about these sanctions, I would not expect them to make much difference. But what seems to be clear for the foreseeable future, next few years, the trade volume between China and South Korea is likely to gradually decrease, exactly because of all these ideas to exclude China from major supply chains. So, but still, China in the foreseeable future will remain the single most important trading partner of South Korea. It's now roughly 1/3 of all trade is with China, partially with Hong Kong, which is essentially the same China. It's a kind of, another face of China.
Okay, well, thank you.
So, Alan, can I just comment on that?
Yes.
I don't disagree with Professor Lankov. Over 26% of South Korea's trade is with China, and their major trading partner. And of course, I think the Yoon administration has made it very clear to the United States that they continue to be concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act legislation, and as the professor indicated, talking about semiconductors and the supply chain and et cetera. So these are issues that obviously have to be worked out between South Korea and the United States in regards to the CHIPS legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act and so-called protectionism that some elements in South Korea are seeing in the United States. So these are issues that will have to be, but I think China will continue, and I agree, will continue to be the major trading partner of South Korea. Hopefully, and I say hopefully China will not react to the Washington Declaration the way they reacted to the deployment of THAAD, the terminal high, if you will, missile defense system that was provided to the Republic of Korea, with the sanctions on South Korean entities in China, and halting a lot of the tourism, et cetera, between China and South Korea. So I personally don't think China will respond that way. I think China will work closely with the ROK and so forth. A lot will depend on where things will be going with, we saw AUKUS, and we're talking about Quad, and I think China will be watching closely about South Korea's interest in joining the Quad and what that means. But I think on an economic, if we're just talking about economics, I think China will continue to keep that channel of a very close relationship with South Korea.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We're kind of reached our hour time here, and maybe just to have a final comments from each of you. And we certainly appreciate taking the time here to share with us. Professor Lankov, any final thoughts?
Well, I've said, I just hope that there will be talks. I just hope that Americans, I think that, well, there are problems on both sides, but I would expect Americans to be more flexible and to do some talks, because what is now happening, we are in this train going through a very long tunnel, dark tunnel, and we are not sure how it's going to end. Maybe there is no exit from this tunnel. So it's better to at least slow down and start looking for some turns. But unfortunately, as Ambassador DeTrani said a number of times, I don't see much interest. Yes, specialists, career watchers, they more or less understand it's necessary, but they're very low in the pecking order. And people who are making decisions obviously don't feel that much interested in making anything dramatic. And it's bad, because it's time to do something dramatic. Otherwise, we'll end up in much greater mess we are now.
Thank you.
On that note, I agree we should be doing something dramatic. And I think we saw something dramatic with the former President Donald Trump. It doesn't mean we can't act boldly again and creatively again, because we have to stop this escalation for the concern that we have about the accidental conflict.
Right.
And that is so important. So what we need to do is obviously come back to negotiations, but get North Korea to cease and desist, no more nuclear tests, no more missile launches, and in return, we have to be forthcoming. And whether that be the lifting of certain sanctions relief in certain areas, but also other prospects. And that's the element of creativity. It's really on us, because we're talking about the Korean Peninsula, and also 25 million people in North Korea, and the human rights situation, where we could have a lot of impact even on human rights if we negotiated with North Korea, if we came back and we put human rights on the table, as we should, in our negotiations with North Korea. We could be helping people immediately in the North, in addition to de-escalation.
Wow, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining our program today. This is the end of our pre-recorded session. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and really brought out a lot of points that we need to think about in terms of how we would initiate a de-escalation of tensions on the peninsula in order to create the environment for denuclearization to actually take place in the future. And of course, China is a big player in that, and we need to find ways to engage China in this discussion and help them to understand the importance of this denuclearization in order to create the environment for dialogue and discussion to take place between North and South Korea for potential dialogue around reunification in the future. So I wanted to conclude the official part of our event today, and I want to actually invite our live participants to stay on. We're going to stop the streaming, and we will have a chance for people just to